This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about ordinary humans who believed that science had no limits. In the early 20th century, the world was changing faster than ever before. Medicine was advancing, technology was evolving, and scientists believed they were standing at the edge of a new era. But ethics had not evolved at the same speed. At that time, there were few rules protecting human subjects. There were no strict consent laws, no international guidelines, and in many places human beings became tools for discovery. Researchers wanted answers to questions no one had dared to ask before. How much pain could a human endure? How long could someone remain isolated without breaking? How easily could a person be convinced to harm another human? To find out, they needed subjects. The people chosen were almost never powerful. They were prisoners looking for reduced sentences, patients desperate for treatment, soldiers told it was their duty. Poor volunteers promised money or medical care. Some signed documents they didn't understand. Some were lied to. Some were never informed at all. They believed they were helping science. They had no idea they were about to become part of history's darkest experiments. Inside the laboratories, everything looked clean and professional. Bright lights, white walls, clipboards filled with data. Wires were attached to bodies, sensors placed on heads, heartbeats monitored in real time. At first, the tests felt simple. Answering questions, responding to sounds, enduring mild discomfort. The researchers spoke calmly. They reassured the participants that everything was under control. But slowly, the limits began to shift. The discomfort became pain. The pain became unbearable. Isolation that was meant to last minutes stretched into hours, then days. Some subjects began to shake uncontrollably. Others cried. Some begged for the experiment to stop. And this was the moment when the most disturbing discovery was made. When people tried to quit, they were rarely forced physically. Instead, they were pressured psychologically. A scientist would stand nearby, calm and confident, and say, "The experiment requires that you continue." There were no threats, no shouting, just authority. And again, people obeyed, not because they were cruel, not because they wanted to cause harm, but because they believed someone else was responsible. The lab coat mattered, the title mattered, the authority mattered. Scientists realized something terrifying. A human could be pushed far beyond their moral limits if responsibility was shifted to someone else. Pain was not the strongest tool. Obedience was. This realization changed everything. Instead of slowing down, the experiments became more ambitious. Researchers began designing tests not just for the body, but for the mind. Fear, stress, identity, sanity. They believed that if the mind could be understood, it could be controlled. And by the end of these early experiments, one thing was clear. Science had crossed a line. But instead of stepping back, it was preparing to go even further. Because now researchers believed there was no human limit that couldn't be broken. And what came next would not just test pain, it would test what it truly meant to be human. After the early experiments proved how easily humans could obey authority, research took a darker turn. Scientists were no longer satisfied with measuring pain or endurance. They wanted to understand something deeper. They wanted to know how far the human mind could be pushed before it collapsed. New experiments were designed where there were no physical injuries at all. No visible wounds, no blood, only pressure. Subjects were placed in isolated rooms with no clocks, no windows, and no sense of time. Some stayed there for hours, others for days. Sleep was disrupted. Lights were turned on and off without warning. Voices were played through speakers, sometimes kind, sometimes threatening. Slowly, reality began to blur. People forgot what day it was. Some forgot their own names. Others began to doubt their memories. When they questioned what was happening, researchers calmly responded that everything was normal, that nothing was wrong. And that response was more damaging than any physical pain. Because once a person begins to doubt their own mind, control becomes effortless. In some experiments, subjects were told they had committed crimes they didn't remember. They were shown fake evidence, false witnesses, altered recordings. At first they denied it, but after hours of questioning, exhaustion, and confusion, something incredible happened. They began to believe it. People confessed to acts they had never committed. They apologized for things they didn't remember doing. Some even created detailed memories of events that never occurred. Scientists recorded everything. They discovered that memory was fragile. Identity was flexible, and truth could be rewritten. This knowledge opened the door to an even more dangerous idea. If a human could be convinced of a false reality, they could be guided to act within it. In later tests, participants were placed into simulated environments. They were assigned roles: guards, prisoners, observers. What started as roleplay quickly turned real. Those given power became aggressive. Those stripped of it became submissive. Cruelty appeared without instruction. Empathy disappeared without warning. The experiment was supposed to last weeks. It was shut down early, not because the data was incomplete, but because the behavior had become uncontrollable. Even the researchers were disturbed by what they saw. Humans didn't need to be taught how to harm others. Under the right conditions, they did it naturally. By now, science had learned something irreversible. Human limits were not fixed. They were conditional. Change the environment. Change the rules, change the authority, and people would change too. These discoveries didn't stay in laboratories. They caught the attention of governments, military agencies, and intelligence programs. Because if the human mind could be broken, it could also be shaped. And what followed next would take these experiments out of labs and into the real world. As governments learned what scientists had discovered, the experiments moved beyond universities and private labs. Funding increased, secrecy tightened, and oversight quietly disappeared. What had once been research became strategy. Military agencies wanted to know how soldiers could resist interrogation. Intelligence groups wanted to know how enemies could be broken without leaving marks. Doctors were asked not how to heal, but how to test limits. New programs were created under classified names. Most citizens never knew they existed. Participants were told they were joining training exercises or medical trials. In reality, they were stepping into controlled environments designed to erase resistance. Stress positions were introduced. Extended wakefulness became routine. Temperature extremes were tested, not to kill, but to see how close a human could come. Subjects were monitored constantly. Heart rate, breathing, cognitive response. When someone collapsed, the test paused briefly, then resumed. Researchers believed stopping too early would waste valuable data. Some subjects emerged confused, some traumatized, some never fully recovered. But the reports focused on results, not consequences. Charts showed how long a human could function without sleep. Graphs measured fear responses under uncertainty. Files detailed how identity weakened when isolation continued long enough. The most shocking discovery came when fear alone proved more effective than pain. Subjects who expected harm often broke faster than those actually experiencing it. The mind once again revealed itself as the weakest point. Soon experiments began involving deception at a massive scale. False emergencies, fake threats, manufactured scenarios where participants believed lives were at stake. People were observed making impossible decisions under pressure. Some sacrificed others, some sacrificed themselves. Some froze completely, and all of it was recorded. By now, a dangerous belief had taken hold among researchers that human behavior could be predicted, controlled, even designed. But something unexpected began to happen. Not everyone broke. A small number of participants resisted. They questioned instructions. They refused to obey. They held onto their identity, even under extreme pressure. These outliers confused the scientists. They didn't fit the data. They didn't follow the patterns. So new experiments were created to break them specifically. Pressure increased, isolation deepened, psychological manipulation became more precise, yet some still resisted. And that resistance terrified the researchers more than failure ever could. Because it meant one thing: human limits were not universal, which meant control was never complete. As the programs expanded, whispers began to spread inside the scientific community. Ethics committees raised concerns. Doctors resigned quietly. Files disappeared. But by then, the experiments had already changed how institutions viewed human beings, not as individuals but as variables. And the cost of that thinking was about to surface, publicly, disastrously, and permanently. The first cracks didn't come from the outside. They came from inside the system. Researchers who had once believed in progress began to question what they were doing. Some noticed long-term psychological damage in participants. Others saw patterns of trauma that could not be explained away as temporary effects. A few scientists tried to slow things down. They requested reviews. They asked for oversight. They warned that the experiments were crossing irreversible lines. Most of those warnings were ignored. The programs were classified, the funding was powerful, and the results were considered too valuable to lose. But secrecy is fragile. A misplaced report, a copied file, a former participant who refused to stay silent. Slowly, information began leaking, not enough to expose everything, but enough to raise questions. Journalists started noticing patterns, unusual hospital admissions, veterans reporting identical symptoms despite serving in different units, civilians describing the same psychological techniques they had never publicly discussed. At first, officials denied everything. They called the claims exaggerated. They dismissed victims as unreliable. They insisted all experiments followed appropriate guidelines, but then documents surfaced. Internal memos that spoke openly about pushing stress beyond safe thresholds. Charts that measured psychological collapse as a data point. Notes describing subjects not as people, but as assets. Public reaction was immediate. Trust in institutions began to crack. Protests formed, lawmakers demanded answers, and for the first time those in charge felt pressure, not from science but from society. Investigations were announced, committees were formed, hearings were scheduled, but much of what people wanted to know was already gone. Files had been destroyed, programs renamed, researchers reassigned. Some experiments were officially shut down, others simply moved deeper underground. The damage, however, could not be erased. Former subjects came forward in numbers too large to ignore. They spoke of anxiety that never faded, memories they couldn't trust, a constant fear that their thoughts were no longer their own. For many, the experiments never truly ended, and as the world argued about responsibility, one uncomfortable truth became clear. Science had learned how to cross human limits, but it had not learned how to undo the consequences. And the question now was no longer what humans could endure. It was what humanity was willing to accept. As investigations expanded, governments were forced to respond publicly. New rules were announced, ethics boards were strengthened. Human rights protections were written into law. On paper, it looked like progress. But for those who had lived through the experiments, justice felt distant. Many victims struggled to prove what had happened to them. There were no videos, no witnesses willing to testify, and in many cases, no surviving records. Some were told their memories were unreliable. Others were offered small settlements in exchange for silence. A few refused. They formed support groups. They shared stories. They compared experiences. And when they did, a disturbing pattern emerged. Different experiments, different locations, same psychological damage, nightmares, panic attacks, loss of identity, an inability to trust authority again. These were not isolated incidents, they were systemic. As public pressure grew, scientists began debating their own responsibility. Some admitted the experiments had gone too far. Others defended their work, arguing that knowledge gained justified the cost. This divide split the scientific community. One side believed science must always push boundaries. The other believed there were lines that should never be crossed. Meanwhile, newer research programs quietly adopted lessons from the past. Not openly, not officially, but subtly consent forms became longer. Language became more careful. But the core question remained the same. How much can a human endure? And how far should we be allowed to find out? Technology now offered new tools: brain imaging, behavioral prediction, artificial intelligence. Experiments no longer required isolation rooms or physical stress. Data itself became the testing ground. Patterns of behavior were analyzed, emotions predicted, decisions influenced, control became invisible, and once again society stood at a familiar edge. The world believed the worst experiments were behind them. But history had already proven something dangerous. When knowledge offers power, someone will always try to push limits again. And the question was no longer whether future experiments would happen, but whether humanity had truly learned from the past. As technology advanced, experimentation changed its shape. There were no more cold rooms or visible restraints, no wires strapped to bodies, no obvious signs of control. Instead, the experiments moved into everyday life. Data became the new subject. Every click, every pause, every decision people made online began to tell a story about the human mind. Researchers could now predict behavior without touching a single person. What frightened experts was not how invasive these methods were, but how willingly people participated. People shared their thoughts, their fears, their habits not in laboratories, but on screens. Algorithms learned what made people anxious, what made them angry, what made them obedient. Slowly, influence replaced force. Behavior could be nudged, choices could be shaped, emotions could be amplified, and unlike the experiments of the past, no one signed a consent form. Psychologists warned that constant exposure to stress, fear-based information, and emotional manipulation could alter the brain over time. That repeated pressure, even in small doses, could change how people think, react, and trust. But proving harm was difficult. There were no scars, no visible breakdowns, only patterns, rising anxiety, polarization, a growing sense of helplessness. Some researchers tried to sound the alarm. They argued that modern experiments were more dangerous than historical ones because they were invisible and scalable. One test could affect millions. Others dismissed these concerns, saying people were still in control. But history had already shown how fragile that belief was. Once again, the same question returned, only in a new form. If humans could be influenced without realizing it, were limits still being crossed? And if no one felt responsible, who would stop it? The lessons from the past had warned against unchecked power. Yet here it was again. Quieter, smarter, and harder to escape. By this point, the line between research and control had almost disappeared. And the final chapters of this story would not be about laboratories or governments, but about what it truly means to protect human autonomy in a world built on influence. By now, the world had reached an uncomfortable realization. The most dangerous experiments were no longer hidden in basements or sealed labs. They were happening in plain sight. Governments, institutions, and corporations all faced the same dilemma: how to balance innovation with human dignity. New ethical frameworks were proposed. Stronger international laws were drafted. Independent review boards gained more power than ever before. For the first time, experiments involving human psychology, behavior, and influence were forced to answer one simple question: who benefits and who pays the price? Survivors of earlier experiments were finally acknowledged. Official apologies were issued. Some received compensation, others received only recognition. But recognition mattered, because it confirmed what many had feared for decades, that science had crossed lines it should never have touched. Education systems changed. Future researchers were trained not just in data and results, but in responsibility. The phrase informed consent became more than a formality. It became a warning from history. Yet even as protection strengthened, experts knew something important. Human limits would always tempt curiosity. The desire to understand, control, and predict behavior would never disappear. So the question evolved: not whether experiments would continue, but how carefully humanity would allow them to happen. In the end, the greatest discovery was not about pain, fear, or obedience. It was about restraint. The experiments that once pushed humans beyond their limits changed science forever, not because of what they proved, but because of what they warned against. They showed how easily authority can override morality, how fragile identity can be under pressure, and how progress without ethics becomes destruction. Today, the most powerful experiments are invisible. They live in algorithms, data models, and predictive systems. But the lessons of the past stand as a safeguard. Every ethical review, every consent form, every public debate, they all exist because humanity learned, at great cost, that some limits must never be crossed again. The case is closed, not because experimentation ended, but because awareness began. And the future of science now depends on one final choice: to explore the human mind responsibly, or to repeat the same mistakes in new forms. What do you think? Were these experiments necessary or unforgivable? Comment below and subscribe for the next documentary. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary meaningful, support the channel by like and subscribe.